Today we are going to talk about Chapter 4 and multicultural perspectives. I know that we discussed this when Ren Adams came to speak to you all in BHS 200, but because this is such an important topic, it will be woven into all of your classes, giving different perspectives, but also repeating some of the same information. We know through brain science that sometimes you need to hear something more than once to remember it or to fully comprehend. So we do want to discuss this topic again, but there are some additional definitions that we'll go over and some additional information. So if we get to our PowerPoint here, we will get started. Okay, so this information comes from Chapter 4 of your textbook. We want to look first at terminology to make sure we remember those terms and also that we're starting from the same page. So culture is the broadest definition that we might use, and if we remember, this can be more than race, ethnicity, etc. It could be the region of the country that you're from. It could be city versus rural, but it could also incorporate family traditions, ethnicity, etc. So ethnicity comes from common ancestry, nationality, and things of that nature. An oppressed group is a group that receives unequal treatment. So there could be a group of people that in one area of the world are oppressed, but in another area do not receive that negative treatment. So this can be based upon where you are at the time that you are providing services to your clients. It could also be based upon where the client is situated. Sometimes if someone has had extreme difficulty in a certain area, then they would move to another state or another part of the country and be hopeful that they would not receive the same treatment. So oppressed groups can change and kind of bend to different circumstances. Also, oppression sometimes is based upon personal events or personal history. Maybe the larger group that I belong to may not be, in your perception, oppressed because of characteristics that I carry, but I myself may have had experiences where I was treated as less than, given negative behavior, or outrightly oppressed because of a characteristic within myself. So whenever a client talks to you about this, we want to make sure that we acknowledge that and do not try to rationalize any event or circumstance that they've been through. Multiculturalism is the relationship between two or more groups, and this can come from a variety of levels of multiculturalism. So it could just be on the outside. Maybe I like to go to the Japanese festival, and so my group is intersecting with that group as I go to this festival, but that's once a year. It's not a regular part of my life. Conversely, I may have a multicultural family where I interact with and spend significant amount of time with people from cultures that are different than my own. So there can be variances here in what multiculturalism means, because by your book's definition, it is simply the relationship between two or more groups. Diversity looks at individual differences that might cause discrimination from the outside world. Cultural empathy is what we want to have as case managers to become or be aware of a client's worldview, and also to recognize any biases that we might have as helpers. Once we recognize them, we need to educate ourselves, and we need to work on not treating any client or any group of people in a negative fashion. So by becoming more aware of each of our clients' worldview, that will help us with our cultural empathy. Stereotypes are oversimplified generalizations about an individual in a group. So there may be an instance that there is a negative event that you experience with someone from a different group, whatever that group might be, but we don't want to stereotype everyone else in that group because of that. There was a conversation that happened at one point in my professional career where someone was trying to explain to me that they were justified in their stereotyping of all Black men as violent, because in their history, a man of African American descent had pulled a gun on them. So I asked them, if that person had been a white man, would you avoid all white men? Would you view that all white men were violent? And that made a little bit of a perspective shift, because the person that was telling the story is Caucasian. So there was a difference in their racial identities. And because it was different than their own, then all of a sudden it became a stereotype. So when you twist it and you say, well, what if this person was the same ethnicity as you? Does that stereotype apply? Then possibly we can open up some of our perceptions of other people and recognize the prevalence of stereotypes and the damage that they do. Racism is a pattern of behavior that denies other people access to opportunities or privileges. So whenever there is a group that has a higher prison population, has a lower CEO representation, is not equally represented in different forums, different stages of life, say at the university setting, etc. When all other things are equal, that is the evidence of racism. It does take your attention, though, sometimes to recognize that. Now, you may live in an area or within a family where you recognize this more readily, but you may not. So we want, again, to educate ourselves on the issues that our clients bring up to us, especially if they fall into these categories. Now, unintentional racism may be an unconscious bias or a negative attitude that we have towards a certain group without recognizing that it is negative or that we are being racist. So calling certain groups of people according to a certain tag name or slur, or what you might see as just another word to describe a group of people, is sometimes unintentional racism. Now, there are hot button words, everybody knows what they are, and everybody knows that they're racist. But there are other terms that people use for groups of individuals that are racist, are negative, are put downs, and we need to be aware of that. Also, we need to be aware of actions that we might have in relation to ethnic groups or racial groups that are different from our own. Again, we're human beings and we are influenced by our family of origin, by the media, by the area of the country that we grow up in. There's a whole variety of ways that these unintentional forces can affect us. Our job, though, as case managers, is just to recognize that about ourselves and then work to do better once we have recognized it. Microaggressions are a variety of things. So they can be verbal or behavioral or environmental that are subtle and have ways of demeaning people. You might be making statements that you do not view as a microaggression, but if the person hearing it feels that there's a negative connotation, it could be something that you need to look at. So let's look at some examples of microaggressions. So one might be you meet a young woman, you find out that she has 3 kids, and your question to her is, do you also have a job? This is a microaggression because it's assuming that she cannot be a mother and a professional at the same time. Or it is making a comment on the fact that she has 3 children. That could be seen as a microaggression to someone who has a larger family and feels that society acts as though you cannot be more than one thing if you choose to have a larger family. The next one would be students from your background don't always do well in college prep classes. This is especially if you're speaking to someone that is viewed as poor, someone of an certain ethnic background, a student of color, someone who was not raised as a native English speaker. Those are all negative categorizations of a group of people saying that you don't belong here, which is not true. Anyone of intellectual ability that can handle college prep classes belongs in college prep classes. Their exterior appearance has nothing to do with that intellect, but it's a microaggression to draw a line between those 2 items. The next one would be a statement versus a question. So let's say that someone has gone to the doctor recently and are just talking about the appointment. And your response to them is, well, obviously your weight is a problem. Their weight may not be a problem. That is an assumption that you make that is negative about someone that you see as a larger frame, heavy, etc. That you are not a medical professional, and that is not your place to make that statement. When speaking to a man, if you automatically say, do you have a wife or do you have a girlfriend? That's assuming that they are heterosexual, and that can be a microaggression. First of all, it's making a lot of assumptions. Maybe they're not in a relationship at all, and that is a sensitive topic for them. Maybe they are pansexual and don't want to explain that to you, or don't want to discuss it at that moment. Maybe they are in a same-sex relationship and are unsure about how you would receive that news, or that fact, I should say, especially given the way that you phrase the question. The next one, you speak really well. This is sometimes said to people of color, someone with a different nationality, or someone with an accent. And so that's making an assumption that because someone belongs to a certain group, that they would not speak proper English, which again is a fallacy and has nothing to do with where someone was born or what their exterior appearance is. That is something that people learn throughout their life, no matter where they come from. So, digging a little bit deeper, we want to make sure that we honor people in their preferences, also in who they are and who they see themselves as. So the first thing that we can do is watch out for those microaggressions. So we want to be careful about those things. And if you do happen to say something that is interpreted as a microaggression, you want to work on that and remove it from your regular conversational options. The next one is we want to acknowledge people's names and titles. So there is a difference between Ms. MS and Mrs. MRS. Ms. MS is an adult woman, so someone 18 or older, whether they are married or not, in a relationship or not. It basically just says that they are an adult. So MISS can be for a younger woman, but that's kind of going out of fashion, and not a lot of people use that unless it's in a derogatory tone. So that can be another microaggression, as if someone is referred to in a condescending way using the word miss. So Ms., again, adult woman, regardless of relationship status. MRS is a married woman. Now, there are some women who very much value the MRS designation on their name, and that is very important for them. So if they tell you, I am Mrs. So-and-so, or on a form, they would mark that box versus any other box, then we want to recognize that, and we want to address them in that way because that is important to them. Sometimes in your facilities, when it comes to names, there are some issues that come up. Sometimes people have pet names, street names, nicknames, what have you, and your facility may have a policy on whether or not it is okay for you to use those types of names. So that's something that you would need to check with your facility about. But there are a lot of facilities, as long as it is not a disrespectful or offensive name, then you would call your client by their preferred name. Now, this is another place that we want to be sensitive to people who are going through transitions. If an individual is transitioning from one gender to another, we should never, ever, ever refer to them by their previous name, even if it is still their legal name. So that is something that all of your facilities are going to support. So let's say that someone's name on their birth certificate is John, and when they introduce themselves to you and on their documents, they designate that their name is Jenny, you would always refer to them as Jenny. Their medical records might need to be listed as John for insurance purposes, but that is not your department. We're not in charge of insurance or payment or any of those things. We are there to build a relationship with Jenny, and so we want to make sure that we acknowledge her appropriately. Another thing to consider is cultural tunnel vision, and that is a perception that is based upon limited information. For myself, when I was younger and a child, I grew up in a very small area in Iowa that was very rural. There was no diversity, period, in the area that I grew up in. And any information that I had about other people different than myself, whether it was that they looked different than me or acted different than me, came from a different area of the country, was only through television. So one of the things that my dad said when we were young was that we would take regular vacations so that we could see that the world was bigger than the very, very small town that we came from. And having his influence and just simply those words from him, the world is bigger than this place. As a child, it opens up your mind that there are differences in people and that's okay. Now, not everybody was raised that way, and not everyone has had the opportunity to have wide experiences in relating to people who look or are different than them. And we want to check ourselves and make sure that we are not operating through a tunnel vision. Also, sometimes with your clients, they have limited information about different parts of the country, different groups of people, and we want to help them also to expand their vision and their perceptions of others, because there are going to be opportunities in their life that might pass them by if they are not taking advantage of those opportunities because of their limited view of the world. When we talk about microaggressions, and in 200 we talked a little bit about this idea of being colorblind. So that is a demeaning term, because for myself, being a woman is important. And so if someone said that's not important, or you shouldn't talk about being a woman, that's the same thing as telling someone of a certain racial identity, that's not important. You shouldn't be focusing on that. Why do you make everything about your race? That is demeaning to their experience, and also the space that they exist within this world. So just as though I would not want someone to say that my being a woman is not important, we want to be sure that we're not going about with this whole idea of color blindness and minimizing the importance of someone's cultural, racial, ethnic background. That is an important part of their identity that we want to honor and acknowledge both at the same time. Next, we do not want to make assumptions. So one way that this comes up is not everyone who falls into the racial category of Asian is from China. So we want to be sure to use a broader term for certain racial groups. Same thing, not all Latin people are from Mexico. So those are assumptions that somebody might make in relation to a particular person. Also, I would pause here to say, why is that the go-to in your description? Does it have anything to do with the issue at hand or the circumstance that you're trying to help the client work through? So we want to acknowledge that first, because if it doesn't have anything to do with that circumstance, then that should not be our first go-to of how we're describing someone. Now, our reactions can come from our background and our upbringing. Also, in American society, we love labels. We love to explain people in succinct terms. And we have determined that gender, race, ethnicity are easy ways to describe someone and talk about them. But all terms have definition. All of them have baggage, whether it's light baggage or heavy baggage. So we want to make sure that we're not making assumptions and not causing other people to make assumptions about an individual. Also, whenever we look at relationships, they may be cultural and not about a diagnosis. My best example of this is within the homeless community. There are groups of people that get together, whether it is for the short term or for the long term, that refer to each other using family terms. So when I worked at the homeless shelter, there was a young woman that I had on my caseload, and she kept talking to me about her mom. And so we would discuss her mom sometimes, and she would tell me, you know, some advice that her mom had given her, or some place that they had gone to. And so we were working through some difficult things going on in her life, and she asked if her mom could come to our next appointment. So I just said, that's up to you. Well, when her mother arrives with her the next time at my office door, I recognized her as another resident of the homeless shelter and not this woman's biological mother. So at that point, I had two things that I could do. I could say, I know that's not your mom, so she can't come in. Or I could recognize that this other individual was very important to my client and talk to her about what she was willing to share in front of this other person, knowing that this was not her biological parent. So that was my choice. If I had thought that this was her biological mother, it might have been a little bit different, also given the age of the individual. And so I might not have gone as in depth, even though we should always, whenever another person is introduced into the mix, we should always go back over confidentiality and go back over boundaries. So biological or not, that should have happened. But because I recognized that this person was not biological, I went a little bit further and discussed boundaries a little bit more in depth, gave the client permission to stop the conversation at any time, to have a conversation separate from her mom. During the conversation, I did refer to that other resident as mom because the client referred to her as mom. And that has nothing to do with the client's diagnoses or anything else going on in her life other than she felt a sense of family with this woman, and this was her support system. So we want to watch for those cultural relationships that might not fit into the boxes that we think definitions of certain terms are. Another thing we want to look at is that resistance can be a healthy response. Someone may resist an environment because they've had a negative experience there. And that's a trauma that potentially needs to be worked through, but that's at the client's timeline, not at our timeline. There may be resistance to talking about a certain event in someone's life because they're not emotionally ready. We don't want to push someone and cause harm to them emotionally by forcing them to discuss things that they're not ready for. So resistance is something that we want to work through with the client. Is it resistance just because we're uncomfortable and it's new? Or is this resistance because it's too much for us to handle at this time, or it's not a safe environment? And that is something that you would have a conversation with your client about to assess which type of resistance it is. Everyone has culture. Wherever you came from, whatever your family structure is, you have some form of culture and everybody else that you work with does, and every client that you will ever see has some form of a culture. And understanding the culture that a client comes from will help you to develop the relationship with them, as well as to know what steps to take, what areas to avoid, or how you might best work through this relationship that you have with them. Social justice is a term that you will hear both in your textbook, but kind of bantered about from time to time. And this is when we are working to promote equality, whether there is an oppressed group that needs some equity. So remember, equity is that everybody gets what they need, not the same thing. We might not all need the same thing. So if I need additional assistance in a certain area, that's equity, versus the next client that you see later in the day that has a separate area of concern. So we want to look for those opportunities for equity, but always be striving for general equality when we're talking about society and how people are treated. Traditional models that you might run across are not effective for every population, and we need to acknowledge that. There are some barriers that we either need to assist our clients with, or we need to recognize those barriers and find alternatives for them. Flexibility on your part is going to be very important. Not everyone is going to work on the timeline that you would prefer. Not everyone is available at the same hours. Now, there are facility hours, and so if someone works at a facility that is only open during certain hours, then the client needs to adjust to that as much as possible. At the same time, you can often get permission from your supervisor, say that your facility, the actual building, is open from 8 to 5. But you have a client who has a regular 8 to 5 job, so you would see them maybe at 7 o'clock before they go to work, or you would see them at 5:30 once they get off. With children, a lot of times, if you work in those departments, you do have to be a little bit more flexible. Children's services, especially during the school year, are often held in the evening. So you would start later in the day, but then work into the evening so that you could participate in those children's services or programs. We want to understand diverse family structures, whether people are married or not married, blended families, who makes up a family. Children may have a very strong relationship with someone that is not a biological parent, or sometimes not even a partner to the biological family that they have. And we want to work within those family structures and acknowledge them as long as they are positive and as long as they are providing support to the client. Also, not everyone succeeds from the same box. So we don't come from the same starting place, and we want to recognize that. Someone might be further back as far as the end goal. So if the end goal is 100 feet in front of us, you are standing what you think is the starting line, but your client is 50 yards behind you. So you need to back up to the client, start where they are. And when we talk about where someone is, that is in a location and their physical presence, but that is also mental. Where are they mentally, and what can we do emotionally, cognitively to get them up to the starting line so then we can move forward through that treatment plan. Another thing that we want to watch out for is showing our privilege. So in the media, they talk a lot about white privilege, and that is in relation to race, but there are a lot of other types of privilege that we want to make sure that we are being aware of and cognitive for. So, economic privilege. If we label clients as resistant or unmotivated because they're missing appointments, we need to find out first, are they missing appointments because they got an extra shift at work and it's important that they have that additional money on their paycheck? Is it that they don't have a car or they don't have a ride? Is it that they have to ride the bus all the time and the bus started a new route, or maybe they were late to the bus stop and then had to wait for the next bus? So there are a variety of barriers that might cause a client to miss appointments. We want to be very careful not to label someone without having all of the facts. Also, calling someone unmotivated is a little demeaning, and we want to find out what their motivation can be. Just because their motivation is different from you or what you want their motivation to be doesn't mean that they have no motivation. As we said in the last slide, resistance can sometimes be a healthy place to come from. And we want to investigate that a little bit further to see if it's just resistance for resistance sake, or if it is coming from a place of protecting themselves. Another area that this comes up when we talk to clients about bettering their financial state, but we don't acknowledge the barriers. It's easy to tell somebody to go get a job, but what about their kids? What about the benefits that they're receiving? Will they lose those? Do they have appropriate transportation? Do they have daycare before and after school? Are their children in a safe neighborhood? How far is it to the potential employers? Do they have the skills that they need to become employed? There are a lot of different barriers and opportunities that we need to look through before we just automatically say, you need to get a job. And then we do not want to ever assume that someone is less intelligent or educated because of factors in their life. So to give you a little bit more information about myself, I am a first-generation college student. My parents do not have any degrees. But when my dad was growing up, they had a very poor family, but my grandparents recognized education as important, even though they couldn't figure out how to get it for their kids. So what they did was they would regularly take their children to the library. And they told their kids, if you can't figure out your own way to college, this is your school. And so my dad reads books all the time. And he has ever since he was a child, because he did not see himself ever going to college. He did not see that as an option for his station in life. And he still wanted to know more about the world, and that was his way around it. And you may run into clients like that as well. They might not have a single degree or been to college a single day in their life, but that does not mean that they are not educated. And we want to honor their experiences and where they come from by acknowledging untraditional ways to be educated on a subject or about the world. Which leads us to educational privilege. So we also, just like we don't want to tell somebody get a job, go to college is not the automatic Band-Aid to put on everything. It is a great place to encourage your clients to consider. It is something that statistically we know helps bring people out of poverty, but we have to address the barriers first. If someone is living paycheck to paycheck and you tell them you need to go to school and not work so much, they can't hear you because they can barely make the bills as it is. So telling them to reduce their number of hours is not an option. Also, if they already feel like their time is stretched to the maximum and you tell them, well, you can take classes online and then study in the evening, they may be 100% zapped by 9 o'clock at night and they would just like to go to bed. So what resources can we help them find to relieve the stress, to help with the children if there are any, to find additional funding sources for college or for daily living? What are the ways that we can help them if college is a viable option and something that we want to put on the radar? Also, not everyone has to get a 4-year degree. We are proving that right here with the BHS program. You all are going to get the jobs that somebody used to have to get that 4-year degree to have. So we want to teach our clients as well, because they might have that mindset. Well, I'm not going to go to school for 4 years. I can't do that. If we talk to them about what their interests are there certificate programs? Are there associate programs? Are there flexible ways that they could get an education once we've helped them with the barriers? And this leads into assuming that your path is the best one. There are multiple ways to reach any goal, and we want to work with our clients to help them find the pathway that is right for them. Another privilege that comes up sometimes is our behavioral privilege. So if you have a client that does not respond to traditional techniques, then it's your job to find alternatives. It is not that they are defective in some way or that they just aren't trying hard enough. Everybody has something that will click for them. And as professionals, it's our job to figure out what those options are. Also, sometimes it may mean repeating something. There is a young person that I work with right now. The family has asked me to kind of provide some additional resources and give some encouragement to that young person. And at the beginning of their mental health journey as a young teenager, there were a lot of therapies that were introduced, including mindfulness and meditation, which is something that everybody offers to everyone because it does work. It is very helpful, but sometimes you're not in the right place. And that's what happened with this young man. When he was a younger teenager and very new in getting a handle on his mental health, he just couldn't calm down enough. And so telling him to meditate or do deep breathing exercises was causing him more stress than helping out. Well, now he is in college, and so he's moving out of his teenage years. He still doesn't 100% buy into this, but he does lean more towards the deep breathing techniques when he gets anxious, the mindfulness. He's trying out meditation. So if we give people time, sometimes it will become effective. Also, he has now found a medication that works, and there are other things in his life that have stabilized, that he's in a place that he is able to receive these techniques. In the meantime, his family had to look at alternatives with the case manager of how to navigate that world. Now, potentially, he might not have ever grown into a cognitive place where those techniques worked for him. Again, it would be up to the professionals in and around his life to discuss alternatives and to keep looking for alternatives if the presented items weren't working. Another thing that sometimes is hard for people in our field to acknowledge is not everybody is going to tell you everything. Some people are not going to tell you anything, and nobody has to self-disclose specifics about themselves or their life. Now, you might think that's contradictory because all services are voluntary that you most likely will be involved in. Sometimes they are involuntary if a child has been removed from a home or somebody's on probation or parole. But still, even though they have to physically show up at an appointment, it is their choice whether or not to participate. So we want to recognize that people don't have to tell you their whole life story. And if you ask a question and they don't want to answer, you move on, because it is not in everybody's nature. Some people are more private than others. Some people take longer than others to get to a point where they're comfortable. And we want to individualize the process that we have with any client that we're working with and not make these types of assumptions. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're not misreading nonverbal behaviors. When I was working with a particular family, one of the parents was a paranoid schizophrenic, and they were not willing to acknowledge that. They did not want to talk about it. They did not want to be on medication or anything like that. So a lot of things that we did were behavioral and also involved the family to make it an emotionally and physically safe place for everyone within the family, especially during episodes that that individual might have. Well, one of the things that came to light is that my client decided that I was bored and that I was anxious and that I no longer wanted to be their case manager because I have a habit of using my hands a lot, which I recognize, but also I have a little bit of ADD, and so my mind sometimes wanders, and I have little tricks that I do to keep my focus in place whenever I am listening to someone or in deep thought. And one of the things that I did at the time was, if I had a pen in my hand, I would move it around while somebody was talking, because that's my way of focusing in. I know it might not seem that way because it seems like I'm doing something, but if I can trick this part of my mind so that the thinking part of my mind can pay attention to you, or I might just turn it around from side to side. I would also kind of play with my hands or put my fingers together, and they interpreted those actions as me not wanting to be there. And so my nonverbal behaviors were detrimental to that person, and I needed to change myself. So first of all, I had to apologize for that. Secondly, even though we don't want to disclose very much about ourselves, there are little nuggets that we can give. So I just said that I have a little ADD, and so that was my way of concentrating on our conversation. That gave a little bit of background. I didn't have to go into it. They tried to ask other questions, and I just diverted, back to the situation at hand. But then I had to make a conscious effort to not do those things. I still catch myself every once in a while, but in no way do I do it as much as I did at that time in my life, because now I'm so conditioned that when I start to do it, I recognize that it's happening. Now, your clients might be the same way. They might have some behaviors that are out of habit or for a purpose that we want to be sure that we do not misinterpret in the wrong way. Now, just like my client said to me, even though they were a little brash about it at the moment, am I boring you? We don't want to ask that way. But We can ask clarifying questions to make sure that the client is engaged. We can talk to them about reframing. So that would be at the end of the appointment, or maybe even halfway through the appointment. If you feel like they're not paying attention at all, you can say, can you help me write down this list? What are we going to do? And so that re-engages them in the conversation and also shows you that they were paying attention when you said, these are the next steps that we're working on, or this is a technique that we're going to use, because they're repeating it to you. Another area that we want to be sensitive to is sexual orientation. And we talked about that quite extensively in 200 during our visit. But there's a whole world of information that you can educate yourself on further. The first thing, though, that we want to recognize is that sexual orientation is just another part of the fabric of human diversity. And acknowledging that that is an important part of anyone's existence is a way to honor that within someone. We kind of have a default that if you are heterosexual, you think, well, that's the norm, but people don't decide one day that they are going to be heterosexual. It is just a decision when someone is not. So we want to change our thinking about those things and recognize that it's an important part of our society and someone's identity. So we want to address the problems of people, but not treat them as the problem. So if someone's sexual orientation comes up during your relationship with a client, or they are discussing an issue with you, we don't want to say, well, that happened because. No, we're going to deal with the event. We're going to get the resources that are needed, and we're going to talk about the emotions that came about because of that event. We're not going to say that it happened because of someone's sexual orientation. Also, all DSM-5 notations, etc., make a very straightforward point that sexual orientation outside of being a heterosexual is in no way a disorder, and we want to make sure that we acknowledge that and that we educate people around us that that is not the mental health concern. Depression might be the mental health concern. Another diagnosis could be, there could be PTSD because of how someone was treated, but their sexual orientation was not the problem. The problem is the treatment by someone else. Then we want to recognize the prejudice that does exist to LGBTQ plus individuals. We want to understand our own gender identity and orientation, as well as how that might affect interactions with other people. Again, checking ourselves, make sure that we acknowledge our own biases and that we work to minimize those, especially when we're talking about a relationship with one of our clients. And then lastly, we never ever want to attempt to change or challenge the orientation or identity of another person. That is their personal journey, just like you have your own personal journey. And we are there to assist them in a positive way. And we want to work on the issues at hand. And that is not the issue at hand. The issue at hand is their housing, their job status, any other issue that the client is experiencing at this time. So for disabilities, this is another area that we want to make sure that we are focusing on the person and not the disability. Again, individualizing care to the individual. Disabilities operate on a continuum, and so there are some that are very evident physically and outwardly, and there are just as many that are not visible. So we want to know what the disabilities of our clients are and what physical or mental limitations that might come along with this according to the client. So if someone has a physical disability, we don't want to assume that they cannot participate in certain physical activities. We would just say, would you like to, whatever the item is. And then the client would say yes or no. Now, there are things that are common sense that are larger issues. So someone who is totally blind, you are not going to take them to get a driver's license. Now, someone who is determined as legally blind, there are sometimes some apparatus that might be able to help them, because legally blind is based upon the prescription that they might receive whenever they get their eyes checked. And that is also not as wide a continuum, but there's a spectrum there of what is considered legally blind. And so we want to talk to our clients about those things. But like I said, there are some things that are a given. Someone in a wheelchair is not going to climb 3 flights of stairs. So those things, you know, we don't want to be ignorant about. But the rest of them, we want to include our clients so that they can let us know what their own abilities are. The best way that we can do this is to advocate for the client to have their own voice. Remember, we are in their lives for just a period of time. And so the best work that we can do is to empower them for the time that our relationship does end. We want to also watch out for vulnerabilities or times that our clients are being taken advantage of. I worked with someone who had a cognitive disability, and they unfortunately had people in their life that would take advantage of them financially. So whenever the disability checks came in, the friends appeared and would say, I know you want to go to the buffet, don't you? So then they go to the buffet and my client was paying for everybody. Or they would talk about that person's shoes or clothes, and then they would say, oh, you need new shoes, I'll take you to the store, do you need a ride? And then they would end up magically getting things for themselves while they were at the store. So in that way, my client was being taken advantage of, and that needed to be addressed. There are also cultural identities. I worked with a young woman at one time who was deaf and only spoke through sign language. She would not write anything out. She did not want to participate in any other form of communication besides sign language, because that was her cultural identity. And as a case manager, it was my job to get an interpreter for her. That was her preference, and I needed to honor that. And I also needed to honor the deaf culture, that I shouldn't be forcing her to fit into my comfort level. She was the client. She needed to be comfortable, and finding an interpreter was the way to do that. So this leads to advocacy. We want to work, we want to work with the client, not for the client. And when you change that word, it reminds you that it is the client's life. We are only here for a short period. And by working with them, we can educate them on resources, we can empower them in certain situations, and we can meet the goals of the treatment plan. But it's always with them. It is not up to us to make all the decisions for them. This should be a collaborative relationship. We first acknowledge how our worldview affects our influence towards the client, our relationship with them, how we speak to them, think about them, etc. But once we acknowledge that, if there are any negative aspects, we would work to get those out of the way so that we can come from the client's worldview rather than focusing on our own. Are we looking at their autonomy? They are a separate person from us. They have their own wishes, desires, goals, etc. And are we advocating for those? Then, do I treat disabled clients differently? We should not be using baby talk or acting as though someone with a physical disability is not at the same educational level as someone else. We don't want to treat someone as younger than they are because of a disability. And so we want to watch for the ways that we might treat someone differently. Then we also examine how the disability affects them. When we look at housing, if someone is not able to climb stairs, we want to find a first floor apartment. Or is there a house that has a ramp? We want to empower the client that when they become employed, or if they are employed for their continued employment, that their organization that they work for is treating them fairly, acknowledging their needs, making those accommodations that they might find necessary. And then when it comes to education, all colleges and universities that are accredited will have a disability support service area, and that department will work with students for whatever their disability is or any additional assistance. So there doesn't have to be a formal disability that someone has to go through all of the process to receive a designation of. Disability support services also helps people who just need a little additional assistance. And we want to make sure that all of our clients are aware of that if they are going into an educational environment. Okay, so that is chapter 4, and you will want to make sure that you are watching Canvas for your assignment deadlines, and also that you are using the calendar to make sure that you're staying on top of that. If you have any questions, just call me or email me. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.